progress? How's everybody doing? Good. All right. So my talk today is called Stripers on the Line, and actually it's two studies that are blended together. So I'm hopefully going to have enough time to really think about integrating field and social science to really positively affect change in the recreational fishery. And I'm also doing this on behalf of Olivia Danylchuk, who was the master's student who basically spearheaded all this, and Grace Castleberry, postdoc in my lab. Striped bass, most people think I just do things far away from home and in tropical waters, but not in this case. Just to give you a context, this is the east coast of the United States. Massachusetts is here. I live here. Very long-lived species, up to 30 years. They get really big. They're anadromous. They're a mixed stocks. They spawn in the Hudson River, Delaware River, and Chesapeake. They move into the coastal waters. They migrate up the east coast, and then they do this cycle annually. It is a incredibly popular recreational fish species, economic value of about $13 billion annually per year, and it's predominantly a release fishery, at least these days, with 5.5 million striped bass released annually, and essentially up to 96% of those fish being released, largely related to regulations. But striped bass stocks are in trouble, depending on how you look at this figure. This is year along the x-axis and millions of tons of fish that are taken out of the fishery. Commercial landings, so it is a mixed fishery. There is a commercial fishery. Commercial landings are this red line, and the rest of the blue is recreational harvest or recreational discard mortality or post-release mortality. And from Dean et al. 2024, recreational release mortality exceeds commercial harvest by over 400%, and release mortality accounts for the largest source of mortality for the stock. Keep that in mind as we get down the road in my presentation. So keeping that in mind, and you're looking in the literature, there's really not a lot of studies. There's a few studies about catch and release on striped bass. What are the aspects of the angling event that are influencing the outcome of those fish? So we decided to take this on and do a field assessment of catch and release practices. Before our study, there was not a study that specifically looked at or included air exposure. So we wanted to make sure that we included that in our work. We did this off the coast of Cape Cod, Massachusetts. We quantified lots of different aspects of the angling event: gear type, hook location, everything under the sun, water temperature, and then we had some segmented air exposure treatments where we asked anglers to either keep the fish exposed, 10 seconds of air exposure, 30 seconds, 60 seconds, or 120 seconds. We did this working side by side with anglers. I sort of think about this as sort of co-production and the research angler approach, where we've got hands-on engagement. Wrong way, Danylchuk. So hands-on engagement, collective learning in the field, conversations with stakeholders, and we had a lot of representation of anglers working side by side with us. This is a different aspect or a different context of citizen science or community science, where we have more control over how the fish are handled and influenced in quantifying the data. Sort of the quality assurance, quality control was relatively high. We also, in addition to all of those metrics, we used reflex impairments. I'm not going to go through all these. We talked about them in several presentations today or over the course of the conference. Tail grab, body flex, loss of equilibrium, and we counted the number of seconds it took for the fish to regain equilibrium. And we did that at the time the fish were landed and at the time that the fish were released, so it accounted for the handling effects as well. All right. This room is very bright. You could take a very univariate approach to this. And we know that the recreational fishery is complex. The way fish are caught and handled is complex. We had a bunch of fish that were caught using conventional tackle versus fly. This is all of these figures are the second ramp scores. So the ramp scores before the fish were ultimately released. You can see that there was a little bit more impairment in the conventional fishery versus fly angling. This is fight time versus ramp score. As fight time increases, ramp score goes down. As water temperature increases, ramp score goes down. As handling time increases, ramp score goes down. They become more impaired. It's pretty intuitive. For air exposure, you can see that things started to really decline at 120 seconds. And it's hard, though, if we're thinking about best practices for catch and release, this is complex for anglers to digest. So what we wanted to do is we actually used a decision tree analysis. How can anglers make decisions to prioritize all the different permutations of things when it comes to the science? And so what I want to really, I don't want you to dig into the details of this would take a much longer presentation, but what really came out first was air exposure, 120 seconds versus the rest of the air exposure categories. And if at 120 seconds that we see, look at the extent of the gray bars, that's when we saw more of those fish losing equilibrium. So we can say, over 120 seconds or 120 seconds air exposure, we got to reduce that. For those other air exposure treatments, you can see that size there was a bifurcation point in size. Larger fish with terms of hook types and water temperatures. You go down here we've got at higher water temperatures on lures with 2 hooks for those larger fish. It was significant. So larger fish at higher water temperatures, we have to be more cognizant of the way that they're handled. And then down on gear type, was really interesting with fly fishing. Those fish that ended up being fought for longer on fly really succumbed to the stresses of that recreational angling, and there was greater reflex impairment. How am I doing? Good. We also, for a subset of fish, used accelerometer loggers, much like the one that Luc La Rochelle was talking about. But we, because the ocean's really big and we didn't use pop-up devices, what we actually did is we had a tether to the accelerometers. So we essentially strapped on an accelerometer to the striped bass. We used conventional gear with the double hooks because that was informed by the other part of the science that we did working with all the anglers. We used 0, 30, and 120 seconds of air exposure, and we monitored the post-release activity for 20 minutes. It's as much as we could do because there was like the big ocean, right? And so we monitored those fish, and what really was a telltale sign was that the fish that lost equilibrium, so this is equilibrium absent is the red at release, and present, and this is overall dynamic body action, so activity patterns. This is time post-release up to 20 minutes. And you can see those fish that had lost equilibrium, right? These are all the air exposure treatments clumped together. I'm going to show you the differences in air exposure treatments in a second. That if you lose equilibrium, your activity patterns are much lower for up to 20 minutes post-release. So if you're energetically not going back to feeding, might be more susceptible to predation. There's a number of different things to think about when we look at this data. If you then look at the different air exposure treatments, we've got 0 seconds, 30 seconds, and 120 seconds, and that 20-minute time step. You can see that for those fish that weren't air exposed, they actually become more active much sooner after about 6 minutes. We sort of see 6 to 8 minutes for those that were exposed for 30 seconds, and those fish that were exposed to 180 seconds, their activity patterns based on the accelerometers were actually still quite low. There were significant differences here, even though it doesn't quite look at. So activity plays a role in terms of the post-release activity or post-release survival. All right. So summing it up, right? What do anglers thinking about that decision tree and those the ramp scores reinforced by the accelerometer data? That obviously translating this to anglers. Minimize your fight time, minimize air exposure, and when the water temperature goes up, you should be more cognizant about fighting fish for so long and air exposing and all that things. Water temperature, especially for larger fish, was impactful. And so what we also want to do, right, is actually to apply this is see how it all fits within the recreational angling community. What do anglers believe? And so and I do this in my lab a lot, where we match science and social science studies at the same time. And so what we did is we did a non-probabilistic survey. We looked at beliefs and perceptions and attitudes related to catch and release of striped bass, threats to the fisheries, management interventions. It was a closed-ended survey. We had 1,600 respondents from Quebec down to Georgia. It was an awesome split between conventional anglers and fly, and about 50% reported releasing all striped bass that they caught. And so yeah, I've got time. Just to sum up really quickly, this is a separate paper, so both of these were published, and this is a really good way to bring these together. Pardon me for moving the mic too far from my mouth. So what was interesting is that recreational anglers, independent of whether you're a conventional angler or fly angler, they acknowledged that air exposure was important to consider. They also acknowledged that hook damage was also something that's important to consider, but we also saw that air exposure was an impact. They didn't believe that water temperature or fish size really matters, even though our data supports that. When it comes to the different ways that striped bass are handled, it thinks of handling time. What are the potential elements of the angling event that influence the outcome for striped bass most? They basically reinforce not lifting the fish out of the water, and also thinking about no fishing at higher water temperatures. And so, but if you look, they did not think that it was relatively important. Yet they still, even though that we know that the recreational fishery is the dominant one in terms of harvest and post-release mortality, when it comes to the perceptions of the health of the striped bass fishery, they were still willing to point the finger at the commercial anglers, and also say that release mortality was important and individual angler practices were important. So looking at the disconnect between the science and the social science will ultimately help steer and fill knowledge gaps in terms of education and outreach campaigns. So Keep Fish Wet has a Stripers in Our Hands campaign. We're thinking about how we can hone those best practices, thinking about the discrepancies that we see between angler behavior and the knowledge and fish welfare, and then misconceptions of the potential threats. So we can really use this to guide targeted education and outreach campaigns based on the science and also what the anglers believe are actually impacting the fish. And I think with that, I'm going to take some time for a few questions. Time for some questions? Hi, Julie. Hang on. I got it. Yeah. What's up, Julie?
So I'm curious how the anglers felt when you showed them the data about post-release. They're like, did they feel personally responsible? Did they accept that they were part of the issue?
Yeah, so I spent a lot of time going to different angling clubs and showing this data, and they're actually starting to really kind of take it to heart. There's still some, generally the really older, gray-haired people in the room, sorry, Dave, that are like, I know what's really influencing the fish, your data doesn't really matter. But I think there's a new generation of anglers that are actually embracing this, and we're seeing an uptake not only in the fly fishing community, but also in the conventional world too.
Okay, kind of following up from that, so you have these recommendations, you're going around to all the clubs and sharing them. Is there any step where you share those with management, like state management too, or is it mainly trying to create a code of conduct within the angling community?
Great question. And so a lot of the things that we do in terms of best practices, a lot of the management agencies won't touch them because they're really difficult to enforce. And so I've had conversations with a lot of the management agencies, like, how do we enforce 10 seconds of air exposure? How do we enforce this? How do we enforce these other things that are driven by the science? So some of it does really have to come up from a grassroots conservation perspective. We've shared this information with like the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission and but there we get to the point where political lobby is actually maybe superseding science evidence. And I don't want to get into the politics, but the striped bass fishery is still in trouble. I think I didn't talk about the history of the striped bass fishery, but in the 80s there was a moratorium. The striped bass stock was like in the tank, and there was a complete moratorium on the striped bass fishery. And if you look at the way things are going now, we're probably headed there again. But my sense is that the management agencies are nervous about how they put the brakes on. So yeah, in a subtle way. But.
Amazing.